So, you want to own a nuclear power plant. Buy the site, pour the containment dome, load the fuel, watch the megawatts flow into the grid. Sounds like the most strategic business on Earth. The output is constant. The fuel is cheap. The technology has existed for 70 years. A single reactor can power 1 million homes for half a century. But here's the strange part. Nuclear power plants generate the cheapest electricity in the world after they're built, and almost none of them get built anymore. By the end of this video, you'll know how a nuclear power plant actually makes money, why the construction phase is where every project lives or dies, why governments quietly subsidize the entire industry, and why a handful of operators are getting rich while the rest of the sector slowly disappears. If you want to follow the numbers all the way through, hit subscribe before you forget. It costs nothing, and it keeps videos like this one coming. Nuclear power plants come in 3 sizes, and they're 3 completely different businesses. A small research reactor, or a small modular reactor, of the kind currently being designed by companies like NuScale, Rolls-Royce, and TerraPower, costs around $1 billion to $3 billion per unit. For that money, you get a reactor producing between 50 and 300 megawatts of electricity, enough to power roughly 50,000 to 300,000 homes. Most of these are still in the design or early deployment phase. The first commercial small modular reactor in North America was approved in 2023, but has not yet been built. The economics are unproven. The technology is real. The deployment timeline keeps slipping. A standard large reactor is a different animal. Think the kind of plant that has dominated the industry for 50 years. A pressurized water reactor or a boiling water reactor producing around 1,000 to 1,400 megawatts of electricity. The price tag, when these get built on time and on budget, runs around $6 billion to $10 billion. The price tag, when they do not, runs much higher. The 2 new reactors at Vogtle in Georgia, Units 3 and 4, were originally budgeted at $14 billion combined and opened in 2023 and 2024 for over $35 billion after 15 years of construction. The Hinkley Point C plant in southwest England, originally budgeted at £18 billion, is now projected to cost over £46 billion and will not produce power until 2029 at the earliest. And then there's the top of the pyramid, a multi-reactor complex operated by a major utility. The Bruce Power Station in Ontario operates 8 reactors generating over 6,000 megawatts of electricity. Constellation Energy, which spun off from Exelon in 2022, operates 21 reactors across 14 sites and is valued at over $50 billion on the NASDAQ. These are not power plants anymore. They are national strategic assets with private owners. But the construction cost is just the start. 2 more costs nobody warns you about. The first is the licensing process, which in the nuclear world is the most expensive regulatory pathway in any industry. In the United States, a new reactor requires approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a process that includes a construction permit, an operating license, an environmental impact statement, and ongoing safety reviews. The application alone costs the operator $50 million to $200 million before a single shovel hits the ground. Total pre-construction licensing and engineering costs typically reach $500 million to $1 billion, none of which is recovered if the project is canceled. In the United Kingdom, the regulatory pathway for Hinkley Point C took over a decade before construction began. In France, the Flamanville 3 reactor entered planning in 2004, began construction in 2007, and finally connected to the grid in 2024, 17 years late and over 5 times its original budget. The second cost is the fuel cycle and the eventual decommissioning, both of which the operator must fund throughout the life of the plant. Uranium fuel itself is cheap relative to the size of the operation, accounting for only around 5 to 10% of the operating cost. But the back end of the fuel cycle is expensive and politically charged. Spent fuel must be stored on site in dry casks because no permanent national repository exists in most countries. The Yucca Mountain Repository in Nevada, designated by the United States Congress in 1987 to receive spent nuclear fuel, has never opened due to political opposition. Operators have collected billions of dollars from ratepayers to fund a repository that does not exist, and the fuel keeps accumulating on plant sites. Decommissioning a single reactor at end of life costs around $500 million to $1.5 billion and takes 20 to 60 years to complete. Then there's the geopolitical dimension. Nuclear power is one of the most politically sensitive industries on Earth. France generates around 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. Germany decided in 2011 to phase out all nuclear power in response to the Fukushima accident and shut down its last reactors in 2023. Japan idled almost all of its nuclear fleet after Fukushima and has been slowly restarting reactors over the last decade. South Korea, China, and the United Arab Emirates have continued building. The United States has largely stopped building new plants while extending the operating licenses of existing ones from 40 years to 60, and now to 80 years. Even the smallest operator understands what the industry has built. A nuclear power plant is a piece of national infrastructure that prints baseload electricity for half a century, controls a fraction of a country's energy security, and decides which utilities get to claim carbon-free generation. That's why governments protect the existing fleet. The surviving operators consolidate, and the customers almost never realize how much of their electricity comes from reactors. So you've got the site, you've got the license, you've got the reactor, the turbines, the transmission lines, the staff. The grid is taking your power. Now we get to the question that actually matters. Where does the money come from? The obvious answer is the electricity, the megawatt hours flowing into the regional grid, the wholesale price set by the energy market, the contracts with utilities that distribute the power to homes and businesses. And all of that is true. But the obvious answer is also the wrong answer. The electricity is not the business. The electricity is the cover charge. The actual business is sitting in a long-term power purchase agreement, a capacity market payment, a production tax credit, and a strategic asset that governments will protect with public money before they let it close. Every nuclear power plant on Earth earns money in 3 completely different categories, and the split is not what you'd guess. The industry calls them energy revenue, capacity revenue, and ancillary revenue. Energy revenue is what the plant earns by actually selling electricity into the wholesale grid, priced in dollars per megawatt hour. Capacity revenue is what the plant earns simply for being available to generate power, regardless of whether it actually does, paid through regional capacity markets. Ancillary revenue is what the plant earns for grid support services, frequency regulation, voltage stability, and the increasingly important production tax credits and zero-emission credits paid by governments to keep the plant operating. At a typical American nuclear plant, energy revenue runs around 70% of total revenue. Capacity revenue runs around 15 to 20%, and ancillary plus subsidy revenue runs around 10 to 15%. The megawatt hours pay the bills, the capacity payments pay the dividend, the subsidies keep the lights on at the plants that would otherwise close. Easiest way to picture it. Imagine a single 1,000 megawatt reactor running at a 92% capacity factor, which is roughly the American industry average. That reactor produces around 8 billion kilowatt hours of electricity a year. At an average wholesale price of $45 per megawatt hour, the energy revenue alone is around $360 million a year. Add capacity payments of around $40 to $60 million a year. Add production tax credits introduced under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which pay nuclear operators up to $15 per megawatt hour when wholesale prices are below a threshold, worth potentially another $100 million a year. Total annual revenue from a single reactor, around $500 million. Now, look at the operating costs. The fuel itself costs around $40 million to $50 million a year for a single reactor. Operations and maintenance staff, around $200 million a year for a single unit plant, or proportionally less per reactor at a multi-unit site. Property taxes, decommissioning fund contributions, regulatory fees, security, and insurance add another $50 million to $100 million a year. Total operating costs for a single reactor, around $300 million to $400 million a year. Net operating margin per reactor, when the plant is well managed and the market price cooperates, around $100 million to $200 million a year. Now, multiply that by a fleet. The numbers stop being theoretical. Constellation Energy operates 21 reactors across the United States and generated over $23 billion in revenue in 2023. The company's nuclear fleet represents over 30,000 megawatts of generating capacity, more than the entire electricity output of countries like Norway or Greece. Vistra Corporation, after acquiring Energy Harbor in 2024 for over $3 billion, now operates a nuclear fleet that produces the carbon-free baseload power that data center operators are desperate to buy. In 2024, Microsoft signed a 20-year power purchase agreement with Constellation to restart the 3 Mile Island Unit 1 reactor in Pennsylvania, which had closed in 2019 for economic reasons. The deal will bring the reactor back online by 2028 to power Microsoft's data centers, and the contract price is rumored to be over $100 per megawatt hour, more than double the typical wholesale rate. Then there's the highest margin revenue source of all: long-term power purchase agreements with hyperscale technology companies. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are racing to secure carbon-free baseload electricity for their artificial intelligence data centers, which consume enormous amounts of power and cannot run on intermittent solar or wind alone. In 2024, Amazon Web Services purchased a data center campus directly adjacent to the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania for $650 million. The deal includes a long-term power purchase agreement with the plant operator for 960 megawatts of dedicated nuclear electricity. Google signed a deal with Kairos Power in 2024 to develop small modular reactors specifically to power its data center operations. The hyperscalers are not buying electricity. They are buying carbon-free baseload capacity at premium prices on 20-year contracts. And here's the part that breaks people's brains. The cheaper the reactor is to run, the more profitable the plant becomes once construction is paid off. The industry calls it the marginal cost advantage. Every megawatt hour, a nuclear plant produces costs around $25 to $30 in operating costs once the plant is amortized. Every megawatt hour the plant sells into the grid earns $45 to over $100, depending on the market and the contract structure. The gap between operating cost and selling price is pure margin. The longer the plant operates beyond its original construction debt payoff, the more profitable each additional year becomes. A reactor in year 40 of its operating life, with construction debt fully paid and licensed extensions in place, generates $200 million or more in annual profit on an asset that has been fully depreciated for decades. So, now look at the architecture. Walk through the financial structure of any modern nuclear operator. Notice anything? The new builds bankrupt the companies that attempt them. Westinghouse Electric, the American nuclear technology giant, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2017 specifically because of cost overruns on the Vogtle and VC Summer reactor projects in Georgia and South Carolina. The VC Summer project in South Carolina was abandoned in 2017 after $9 billion had been spent with no working reactor to show for it. Areva, the French nuclear conglomerate, was effectively dissolved and restructured by the French government in 2017 after cost overruns on the old Kilowatt reactor in Finland, and Flamanville 3 in France pushed the company toward insolvency. The companies that built reactors went broke. The companies that operate already built reactors print money. The economics of nuclear power are even sharper than the architecture. A new reactor on a fresh site requires 15 years of construction and tens of billions of dollars of capital before generating its first kilowatt hour. An existing reactor with 30 years of operating history requires almost nothing to keep running and generates electricity at a marginal cost lower than almost any other generation source. The industry has a term for this dynamic: stranded brilliance. The technology is real. The plants that exist are extraordinary assets. The barrier to creating new ones has become almost impossible to overcome in Western markets. And at the very top of this pyramid sits the strategic value of carbon-free baseload power. As governments push toward net zero electricity targets, nuclear plants are the only generation source that produces zero carbon emissions, runs 24 hours a day regardless of weather, and operates at the scale required to power major industrial demand. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 created a production tax credit specifically to keep existing nuclear plants operating. The European Union classified nuclear energy as a sustainable investment under its taxonomy framework in 2022. So here's the whole revenue model in one sentence. Megawatt hours produced multiplied by wholesale price, multiplied by capacity payments, multiplied by government subsidies, multiplied by reactor lifetime. And every single decision in the industry, from license extensions to fuel procurement to refurbishment investments, exists to maximize one of those 5 numbers. The reactor is the bait, the grid contract is the trap, the carbon-free electron is the product. And the electricity, the thing most people think the business is built on, is the cover story that keeps the long-term power purchase agreements flowing. So with all this guaranteed baseload demand, all this captive industrial appetite for carbon-free electricity, all this engineered government support, why do nuclear power projects ever fail? The short answer is the construction. Out of every dollar of nuclear project revenue, an enormous portion is committed before the plant generates a single kilowatt hour. A new reactor costs $10 billion to $40 billion to build, and takes 10 to 15 years from groundbreaking to grid connection. The operating economics, once the plant runs, are extraordinary. The construction economics before it runs have bankrupted some of the largest engineering firms in the world. About half of the construction budget on a new reactor disappears into civil works, the concrete containment dome that surrounds the reactor vessel, the reinforced foundations capable of withstanding earthquakes and aircraft impact, the cooling water intake structures, the turbine hall, the spent fuel storage facility. A modern reactor site is one of the most complex civil engineering projects on the planet, comparable in scale to building a small airport, but with regulatory requirements an order of magnitude more demanding. Another major portion goes to the reactor vessel itself, the steam generators, the turbines, the control systems, and the safety equipment. These components are manufactured by a small number of specialized suppliers worldwide, with lead times of 3 to 7 years per major component. Westinghouse, Framatome, GE, Hitachi, Rosatom, and the Korean and Chinese state-backed manufacturers are essentially the entire global supplier base. Then, there's the stuff most people never think about, the skilled labor force. Building a reactor requires welders certified to nuclear quality standards, electricians trained in safety-critical systems, instrumentation technicians, radiation protection specialists, and quality assurance inspectors. The American nuclear industry lost most of its specialized construction workforce during the long pause in new builds between 1979 and the late 2000s. When Vogtle 3 and 4 began construction, the project had to retrain a generation of workers from scratch, which contributed significantly to the delays and cost overruns. Then there are the regulatory inspections, the design changes mandated mid-construction when new safety analyses are required, the litigation, when local communities challenge the licensing, and the financing costs that compound through every year of delay. The guaranteed top line is real once the plant runs. Everything before that is a fistfight. That fistfight is where most nuclear projects fail, and it has a small set of repeat patterns. Nuclear power projects can fail for a lot of reasons, but 2 mistakes show up over and over again. Mistake 1. First-of-a-kind construction with regulatory uncertainty. The VC Summer project in South Carolina was supposed to add 2 AP1000 reactors to an existing nuclear site at a budgeted cost of around $10 billion. Construction began in 2013. By 2017, the project was years behind schedule and billions over budget. Westinghouse, the reactor designer and primary contractor, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in March 2017. The utility partners abandoned the project 4 months later after spending over $9 billion with no working reactor to show for it. South Carolina ratepayers had already been paying surcharges to fund the project under a state law that allowed pre-collection of construction costs. They paid for a plant that was never finished. The Olkiluoto 3 reactor in Finland, originally scheduled to begin operating in 2009 at a cost of €3 billion, finally connected to the grid in 2023 at a cost of over €11 billion. Mistake 2. Wrong market for the product. This one has killed a lot of reactors. Throughout the 2010s, several operating nuclear plants in the United States were forced to close prematurely because they could not compete with cheap natural gas in deregulated electricity markets. Vermont Yankee closed in 2014. Kewaunee in Wisconsin closed in 2013. San Onofre in California closed in 2013 after steam generator problems. Indian Point in New York closed in 2021. Palisades in Michigan closed in 2022, only to be approved for restart by 2025 under the new economics of the Inflation Reduction Act. 3 Mile Island Unit 1 in Pennsylvania closed in 2019 and is now being restarted to power Microsoft data centers under a deal worth potentially over $15 billion over the contract life. The plants that closed during the cheap gas era were not technically obsolete. They were economically stranded in markets that did not yet value carbon-free baseload power. Step back for a second. The economics of this industry are paradoxical. A nuclear power plant has one of the most reliable revenue mechanisms in business. It produces electricity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for 40 to 80 years, at an operating cost lower than almost any competing generation source. And yet new construction projects bankrupt the companies that attempt them, and existing plants nearly closed in droves before government subsidies arrived to save them. Why? Because the math only works if the plant gets built, on time, on budget, and if the wholesale electricity market values its product. The construction risk is concentrated in a 15-year window before any revenue arrives. The market risk is concentrated in the deregulated competition with subsidized renewables and cheap gas. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you make if you do this right? 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1. Acquiring an existing 1,000 megawatt reactor with 20 years of license remaining. Acquisition cost around $2 billion to $4 billion, far less than the cost of building new. Annual revenue around $400 million to $500 million from energy sales, capacity payments, and production tax credits. After operating costs of around $300 million a year, your real annual profit is around $100 million to $200 million. Payback on the acquisition, 10 to 20 years. The most undervalued strategic asset in the American electricity market. Constellation, Vistra, and Talen Energy have built billion-dollar businesses doing exactly this. Scenario 2. Building a new large reactor on a fresh site. Construction cost, $15 billion to $40 billion over 10 to 15 years. Annual revenue once operating around $600 million to $1 billion, depending on contract structure with hyperscale buyers. Net operating profit around $300 million to $600 million a year. And here's a fun fact most people miss. The payback on a new reactor, even with premium data center contracts, is 20 to 40 years, which is longer than the careers of every executive who would approve the project, longer than the political cycle of every government that would back it, and longer than the patience of most institutional investors. That's why new nuclear gets built almost exclusively by state-backed entities in China, Russia, South Korea, and increasingly the United Arab Emirates. The Barakah plant in the UAE, built by Korea Electric Power Corporation, came online between 2020 and 2024 at a cost of around $24 billion and now generates 25% of the country's electricity. And if you survive long enough, you become something specific. Joseph Dominguez, the chief executive of Constellation Energy, has built one of the most valuable nuclear operating businesses in the world by acquiring existing plants and securing long-term contracts with technology companies. EDF, the French state-controlled utility, operates over 50 reactors across France and the United Kingdom and remains the largest nuclear operator on Earth, even after decades of financial difficulties. Korea Electric Power Corporation has emerged as the most credible commercial reactor builder in the world, primarily because the Korean government absorbs the risk that bankrupted Western firms. The ones who build generational wealth in nuclear today do it by buying operating plants at distressed valuations, not by building new ones. So, if you do decide to own a nuclear power plant, just remember the most important rule of this business. The reactor is the bait. The construction is the trap. The operating license is the asset. Make sure you're not building a new plant. You're buying one that someone else already built, already paid for, and already absorbed the construction risk that would otherwise destroy you.